Happy summer season, everybody, and Tony here with my review of Gounod's Roméo et Juliette, which I saw at the Teatro Real de Madrid. The conductor was Carlo Rizzi. The production was done by Thomas Joly. The sets were done by Bruno de Lavenère. The costumes were done by Sylvette de Quest. The lights were handled by Antoine Travers. The choreographer was Josefa Madocchi. The combat director or fight choreographer was Juan Artur Braun, and the chorus master was Jose Luis Basso. I was really excited to set foot in Teatro Real de Madrid because this was my first time in this specific theater, let alone entering it, because I heard a lot of amazing things about it, and the first opera that I managed to catch tonight was Gounod's Roméo et Juliette, which also boasted a cast consisting of veterans and fresh faces. So before I get to the singers, a few words on the production. It's essentially a combination of the Rocky Horror Picture Show, Phantom of the Opera, Baz Luhrmann's version, let alone film version of Romeo and Juliet, and Moulin Rouge. There's a lot of voguing that tended to happen in the first half of the opera. And even with Juliette's sleeping death scene, in which she is sort of imagining a lot of the will-o'-the-wisps. On top of that, what I've noticed about a great deal of the costumes is that there's a hybrid feeling about them. One moment you feel like you've watched Masquerade from Andrew Lloyd Webber's musical The Phantom of the Opera, and another moment you see slightly more modern clothes juxtaposed with the clothes worn in 16th to 17th century Verona, which manages to create this hodgepodge of anachronisms galore, and you feel kind of confused as to what era is this production of Roméo et Juliette is set in. It does feel confusing, but I do kind of like the dark atmosphere that it managed to work with, because this is a very intriguing yet troubling tale of young love gone wrong, but also about the warring families, i.e. the Montagues and the Capulets. This was quite an intriguing visual feast that is full of style and has sufficient substance that managed to stay true to parts of the text, but sometimes I do feel that the voguing style dancing tended to be distracting, and sometimes it feels like it is taking me away from the main action of the opera. At least the costumes looked pretty interesting to look at, complete with anachronisms galore, as well as costumes that meshed different epochs to show that Roméo et Juliette is definitely a tale as old as time, and it doesn't matter if it's told in its original 16th century or if it's done by modern productions. It's still a timeless tale, and that's what I managed to retrieve from this production of Roméo et Juliette. Distractions and certain questionable moves and all. Overall, I might have had some mixed feelings about Thomas Joly's production of Roméo et Juliette, but at least it's still appealing. I can kind of see the references from Rocky Horror Picture Show with the overall dark atmosphere and a lot of the choreography that tended to occur, as well as Phantom of the Opera, with that dark, haunting atmosphere and the overall feel that I managed to retrieve from this production, being a timeless tale and all. Whilst I would have stuck with a more traditional production, at least I could still enjoy it, and at least it was not insulting to my intelligence. Now we get to the bread and butter of this review, the singers. We have Ismail Hordi and Yulia Muzichenko-Greenhill as the titular hero and heroine respectively, Romeo and Juliette. Starting off with Ismail Hordi as Romeo, I've been following this gentleman's career for what feels like over 20 years. From his beginnings as a young lyric tenor, specializing in a lot of the bel canto and French roles, to really continuing to own them. I remember first hearing him as Percy from Ana Bolena when he sang this role alongside Irina Lungu as the eponymous heroine nearly 8 or 9 years ago. He was in good voice, and he continues to be in really good voice. What I admire most about Ismail Hordi is his sensitivity. His tone is sensitive, and he knows how to emit that loveliness for Romeo exceedingly well. He has good musicianship, and he has this dashing charisma that made him thoroughly engaging to watch on stage. The one thing that I felt like I was missing from Ismail Hordi was a lot more vocal charisma and a lot more color. Every time I think about Romeo, I think about a lot of the great lyric tenors of the past, those being Augustorello Affray, who also sang a lot of spinto tenor roles like Don José and Rôle de Nangy. Beniamino Gigli, a similar case, but Gigli was a natural full lyric tenor with a lot of sensitivity, a whole lot of beauty, and a whole lot of dimension in his voice that made him thoroughly rewarding in roles such as Romeo, as well as Faust and Rodolfo, and even Don Ottavio. And lest I forget about Jussi Björling, one of my all-time favorite Romeos, all thanks to his complete technique and the overall dedication he has to his craft. I also dare not forget about Nikolai Gedda and Alfredo Kraus. And if we're talking about a more sharp instrument that is so incisive, Franco Corelli, of course. And when listening to Ismail Hordi's voice, I'm kind of reminded of an amalgamation of Léopold Zimonou, Alain Vanzon, and Alfredo Kraus. I hear a bit of Alfredo Kraus in his voice, considering that Senor Hordi specialized in a lot of light lyric to lyric tenor roles, which he had been owning for many years. So while his voice could use a whole lot more charisma, depth, dimension, and a whole lot more emotional investment, a la Beniamino Gigli if you want legitimate Italian singing, or Jussi Björling if you want a more rounded and a lot more of a complete technique, because in Senor Hordi's case, I noticed that he was kind of nasal, and there were times that I felt like his wings were clipped. I still have to give Senor Ismail Hordi some credit for what he was able to accomplish as Romeo. His sensitivity and his absolutely fine and dashing stage presence were assets that he knew how to work exceedingly well with. Yulia Muzichenko-Greenhill was actually darn solid as Juliette. I have seen this young coloratura soprano's career grow and flourish, starting off with, as I stated before, in my review of her Gilda when she sang this role barely 3 years ago at the Deutsche Oper Berlin. She started as a lot of these soubrette-ish roles before finding her direction as a lyric coloratura soprano who could also do a great deal of light lyric soprano roles. And seeing her graduate from Olympia to nowadays tackling Violetta Valéry and Juliette, while also still having to go at slightly lighter roles like Olga Sukharev from Giordano's Fedora, was absolutely stunning. She knew how to launch at those high notes with full abandon, and she knew how to tackle each and every moment with commitment, interest, and a great deal of loveliness. In fact, her lovely stage presence was her greatest asset. She used a lot of youthfulness in how she portrayed Juliette. She knew where and when to have her moments of desperation, considering that she does not want to lose her precious Romeo. And she also knew the ins and outs of her character wonderfully well. She did have a bit of a thin start at the first act of the opera. And I mean that there were times that she sounded a little bit unsupported, and I felt like she was a bit hollow, but she picked herself up exceedingly well. And I thought that her interpretations of Je veux vivre and Dieu, quel frisson court à mes veines were absolutely fabulous. Granted, the one thing that is working against Yulia Muzyczenko-Greenhill is the unfortunate inconsistency in her chest tones and head tones, let alone head voice and chest voice. There were times I felt like her voice still needs a whole lot more coordination from bottom to top, as well as taking advantage of those chest tones, because that's where the real strength comes in. That's where she should have really improved on. In fact, it says a lot when a lot of these lyric sopranos and lyric coloratura sopranos who sang Juliette, such as Yvonne Gall, Ninon Vallant, Aidé Norena, Bido Sayel, Janine Michaud, Anna Montfort, Mirella Freni, and even though they did it as concert pieces like the Je veux vivre and Dieu, quel frisson court à mes veines, Joan Sutherland in the former's case and Clara Ebas in the latter's case, it says a lot that these sopranos had way more coordinated chest tones and really took advantage of them, rather than just also singing a lot of high notes that sound sparkling. And lest they forget about Amelita Galli-Curci and the great Luisa Tetrazzini. It says a lot when those coloratura sopranos also had wonderful chest tones as well as those sparkling high notes. And that's something I would love for Yulia Muzyczenko-Greenhill to work on, those chest tones, because that is where her voice can really grow and can really maintain its vocal health. Even with that caveat of her chest tones being insufficient, and even though I wanted a whole lot more from Yulia Muzyczenko-Greenhill, I still have to give her credit for what she was able to emit as Juliette. She was incredibly credible in this role, all thanks to her darling stage presence and how she was able to make the character live and breathe. And she worked darn well off of Ismael Jordi's Romeo, both vocally and theatrically, to the point where I was in awe. Not to mention, she also received a huge standing ovation. I might have kind of disagreed with the audience about it, but I could see why. She was credible in her portrayal as Juliette. Her high notes were sparkling, and she had a darling stage presence. I just wish that she continued to develop her chest tones a lot more so that her voice can become a whole lot more complete, and that she could also embrace, let alone further embrace, the color palette from chiaro to scuro, and basically have a great deal of chiaroscuro in her voice. Frère Laurent was sung by Jean-Fernand, who was absolutely sterling, all thanks to his round, rich, and cavernous basso cantante voice, and he had an authority on stage that made him absolutely unbeatable. There was not one note that I thought was wrongly placed. He did not have a wobble, and he was smooth from beginning to end, all helped by that virile stage presence. Mercutio was sung by Carles Pachon, who was charming and who was very charismatic. There were occasions where I thought that his voice was on a bit on the verge of wobbling, but his charisma, his charm, and his overall dashing stage presence made him thoroughly addicting to watch. And when you think of great Mercutios of the past, you'd automatically think of singers such as Michel Don, who had such a sturdy Gallic French tone. And he definitely owned the role so well in terms of what he was able to accomplish. And with Carles Pachon, he was absolutely good. His stage presence was magnetic. It's just that I wish that he continued to stabilize and strengthen his voice in the best possible way so that he can continue having a long-lasting opera singing career. Carmen Artaza was creamy toned and lovely as Stefano. Her solo aria, Que fais-tu blanche tourterelle, was sung with loveliness, charm, and she managed to make Stefano such a charming and lovely character to watch. Granted, it says a lot when sopranos such as Claudine Collard and Mimi Benzel managed to have not only sterling high notes, especially when they hit that high C, but also really good chest tones. And even glorified short sopranos like Frederica von Stade or Anne Murray, who also had those chest tones and could hit the high C with ease. And I do hope that Carmen Artaza continues to take advantage of whatever she can improve on, further strengthen her voice, and also ensure that her vocal resources do not fade away anytime soon, because she is a young talent worth rooting for. And I would really hope that her career continues to grow from strength to strength. A name that is so new to me, but has thoroughly impressed me tonight, was the bass baritone singing Lord Capulet, and that was Jean-Fernand Setti. I was absolutely amazed with what Monsieur Setti had to offer, because his tone was a velvety, round, rich, and thoroughly engaging sound that was absolutely amazing and addicting to listen to. His virility was unparalleled. His sense of musicianship and musicality were thoroughly unparalleled. And I just loved everything about Monsieur Setti in terms of his stage presence and in terms of his vocal prowess. There was not one moment that I thought he was wobbling. And granted, I still love the likes of Charles Gounod as Lord Capulet or Paul Plançon, because these were old school singers I've always admired in that particular role. regardless, I thought that Jean-Fernand was absolutely engaging as Lord Capulet, and his vocal resources were thoroughly formidable. David Alegre might sound rather whitish toned as Tybalt, and there were times that his nasality did get to me, but I could never deny that his stage presence was dashing, fine, and noble. It's just that I wish he had a lot more pharyngeal space in his voice so that it could sound a lot rounder, richer, and not masky and nasal. But still, he was in fine form. I just wish for a lot more charisma in his voice, but at least his stage presence was quite handsome and dashing. We even have the honor of having the veteran lyric slash borderline dramatic slash Falcon mezzo-soprano Sonia Ganassi sing and perform the role of Gertrude, the nurse of Juliette. Her stage presence and her involvement with the drama were thoroughly unparalleled. And even though she is in the twilight of her years as an opera singer, there were occasions that she did sound in relatively decent form with her chest tones, and she still had that trademark creamy voice that I've always admired about Sonia Ganassi, even when she's taking on Falcon roles or roles that are slightly more dramatic, and even roles that she was really good at, such as the coloratura mezzo roles of Angelina from Cenerentola, and even heavier stuff, more poignant stuff like Giovanna Seymour from Donizetti's Anna Bolena. Everything about Sonia Ganassi was absolutely wonderful. Even though her voice these days, or maybe even back then, was not the chestiest or the one that I would consider the most complete. And what I've also noticed about Sonia Ganassi is that she does sound like a less chestier version of Fiorenza Cosotto, considering the repertoire that she'd been doing. From the more lyrical roles to the roles that required her to do a lot of agile singing to the more dramatic roles. Regardless of any criticisms I have towards Sonia Ganassi, she was still an absolutely engaging singing actress that I thoroughly cherished. David Lagares was dashingly handsome and thoroughly fine as the Duke of Verona. Granted, while there could be a rounder, richer, darker, and more cavernous basso profondo / basso cantante voice for this particular authority figure, I thought that Senor Lagares managed to sell it with his stage presence and sell it in terms of his virility that made me engaged with what he was about to offer. And I do encourage him to continue strengthening his basso cantante voice because he has an amazing future ahead of him. Tomeo Bibiloni was thoroughly dashing as Count Paris, all thanks to his finely tuned and absolutely handsome lyric baritone voice. Josep-Ramon Oliver was just as handsome and just as wonderfully toned as a lyric baritone singing Gregorio. Pablo Martinez was wonderfully fine, all thanks to his light tenor voice being put to fine use as Benvolio. Javier Castañeda was thoroughly round, rich, and deep and authoritative in his small role of Frère Jean. And I have to give loads of kudos to Laura Suarez as Manuela, Elena Castresana as Pepita, and Bartomeu Huiscafre as Angelo for doing really fine jobs in their ensemble. I also have to give credit to the dancers, Victor Brocos, Anke Klink, Paul Saint-Paul, Antonella La Calamita, Alberto Garcia, Yandros, Quinita, Lauren Calvo, Ines Menendez, Elisa Morandi, Gabriel Nabo, and Paloma Ramos for doing equally fine jobs in their roles in terms of their choreography and in terms of their collaboration with the singers. So overall, the singing, let alone the performances, were thoroughly interesting, and there is the great deal of potential, especially in the younger batch. Whilst I do crave for a lot more charisma, let alone vocal and theatrical charisma from Ismail Hordi, and I do feel that Yulia Muzyczenko Greenhill should really sharpen her technique a lot more. I thought these two were in fine shape, even to the point where they did emit such fine appeal in terms of their vocal abilities and their stage presence. And I also must give it to all the other singers who managed to steal the show so well, especially when it comes to Jean-Fernand Setti's superbly sung Lord Capulet. My goodness, was he able to steal the show from everybody's feet that I was thoroughly entranced with what he offered as a bass baritone. And I also have to give it to Jean Tegon for doing handsomely as Frère Laurent. So overall, the singing, as I stated before, thoroughly fine all throughout, and I do hope that Ismail Hordi and Yulia Muzyczenko Greenhill continue to grow with vocal strength as well as with a lot more vocal charisma and further sturdy their techniques so that they will not end up dealing with certain declines. And here's also hoping that they will continue to go from strength to strength. The conducting done by Carlo Rizzi was thoroughly nuanced and thoroughly fabulous all around. There was not one note that I thought was wrong. He definitely took advantage of a lot of the heavy and intimate moments and did so with flair. And the chorus and the orchestra of the Teatro Real de Madrid were absolutely intriguing, and they worked extremely well off of each other. Tonight's first time inside the hallowed halls at the Teatro Real de Madrid proved to be one that I will always cherish. It was such a fine joy seeing Ismail Hordi as Romeo and Yulia Muzyczenko Greenhill as Juliette own their roles well, and I would love for them more than anything to keep on strengthening their technique as well as ensure that their voices remain in tip-top shape. And out of all the other roles, I thought that Jean-Fernand Setti stood head and shoulders above the rest and was a huge cut above the rest as one of the finest singing actors I have ever witnessed on stage. So bravo to him, and I'd love to see a lot more performances of this fine bass baritone. And for those of you who caught Gounod's Roméo et Juliette at the Teatro Real de Madrid, what'd you think of it? Do you feel that the production was eclectic in its delivery and you thought that it was reminiscent of the Rocky Horror Picture Show or the Phantom of the Opera or Moulin Rouge or Baz Luhrmann's vision of Romeo and Juliet or all the above? Did you feel that Ismail Hordi and Yulia Muzyczenko Greenhill did absolutely fine in their roles? Or did you feel that the overall execution faltered and was lacking? please let me know in the comments below. Well, that's it for my review of Gounod's Roméo et Juliette at the Teatro Real de Madrid. If you want more of my reviews, please subscribe to my channel. Please like the video and share it with your friends. And until then, I hope you all have a fine summer season. And hopefully I will also be able to produce another review of Romeo et Juliette, also at the Teatro Real de Madrid, but this time with Javier Camarena as Romeo and Nadine Sierra as Juliette. So until then, good night everybody.